Hi, folks. Welcome back. Dennis Feitosa, also known as Def Noodles. And today we're going to be talking about something we've already started touching on, the Elliot Page arc surrounding Christopher Nolan's new film, The Odyssey. Now, Elliot Page, formerly known as Ellen Page, is a transsexual actor who transitioned from female to male. Elliot currently identifies as Elliot. That's the name we're going to use out of respect. Around here, we try to, keep things a little respectful. We may disagree with people's ideas or opinions, but we're still going to try to treat them with some basic dignity and respect. That said, Elliot Page has once again found herself in the crosshairs of the culture war because, as you'll remember, many people have been questioning how someone of Elliot's stature could possibly qualify to portray a Greek hero. So I think it goes without saying that all of this came to a head during this promotional run for Nolan's Odyssey. Elliot has been discussing broader issues surrounding gender and sexuality in her interviews, embracing a postmodern deconstructionist view of sex and identity that, frankly, I find incredibly detached from reality. It often sounds like academic jargon being used to explain away basic biological realities. Some of the statements Elliot has made are, in my view, among the most unbelievable things that you will ever hear. And judging by the reaction online, a lot of other people seem to be feeling the same way. So with that in mind, here's a clip. This comes from Elliot Page's appearance on Democracy Now!, and it's left a lot of people completely befuddled.
In terms of looking at nature as if it's some sort of cis heteropatriarchal structure is absurd, and that this, gender binary that we've created is nothing but a quaint little myth. And I think, her work and this documentary really, really shows that what we have been taught in school in regards to these structures, men being superior, women being inferior, submissive or what have you, it being this, heterosexual existence is just completely false. And I think what's so wonderful about this documentary is it really illustrates, why that information has been so suppressed. And how important it is for us to all learn about this, and how it's only expansive and exciting, all of this information.
What a truly strange argument to make. Here you have someone talking about the so-called cis-heteropatriarchal structure, describing it as absurd, while at the same time identifying as a man. Am I the only one who finds that strangely hypocritical? Do you really believe that the male identity is completely interchangeable, that there's no underlying essence to what it means to be a man? Because that's ultimately what this sounds like. It sounds like this person has deconstructed their own existence to the point where they believe they can simply become whatever they decide they are. Now, this whole thing actually reminded me of a recent conversation I watched between Tucker Carlson and Jay Dyer, where they discussed nominalism. Now, nominalism is a metaphysical theory in philosophy that asserts universal concepts and abstract objects, things like redness, humanity, triangularity, or even categories such as gender, do not actually exist in reality. Instead, it argues that only concrete individual objects exist, and that the general terms we use are merely linguistic labels created by the human mind to group similar things together. Now, in order to understand nominalism, it helps to look at what's known as a classic problem of universals. See, in realism, a view championed by Plato, they argue that universals exist independently of physical objects. For example, there is a perfect circle that exists as an ideal form, and every circle we draw is simply an imperfect copy of that ideal. In nominalism, they reject that entirely. It says there is no independent thing called a circularity. There are simply various round objects, such as a coin, a ball, a wheel, and the human mind invents the word circle to categorize all of them. Now, what this effectively does is strip the meaning out of the word itself. The category still exists, but it becomes infinitely flexible. You can attach it to virtually anything, regardless of what that thing actually is. Taken to its most extreme conclusion, one could argue that this computer mouse that I hold right next to me, sitting on this table, is a human being. Why not? If words are merely labels we assign however we please, then nothing stops me from calling this a human, except, of course, reality. It's a piece of plastic. A mouse cannot be a human because there is an essence to being a human. There are defining characteristics that make a human a human. That's why I think nominalism, when taken to its logical extreme, becomes a form of deconstructive postmodernism where nothing has any inherent meaning anymore. Everything becomes infinitely malleable. You can define reality however you want, and if necessary, you can even invoke science by cherry-picking examples from nature to justify why something can be whatever you want it to be. You search for exceptions, isolate them from the broader biological context, and then use them to justify breaking away from established norms because you simply don't like the reality you find yourself living in. Even in examples Elliot is citing here in the clip we just watched, there's something important to remember. Yes, behaviors differ across species, social structures differ across species, biological roles differ across species. That's true. But every species has its own inherent nature, and those realities are defined by the biological characteristics unique to that species. A lion has its own essence. There are defining characteristics that make a lion a lion. And those biological characteristics shape how it experiences reality, from the way it hunts, to the way pride dynamics function, to the roles individual lions play within that social structure. A lion is never going to behave like an elephant because it isn't an elephant. I don't think I have to explain that to any of you. It's obvious to anyone with even half a mind. That simple observation leads you to that conclusion. That's ultimately why I think the LGBTQ argument being presented here by Elliot is seriously fallacious. It's attempting to justify what I believe is a psychological condition by denying the existence of objective categories altogether. And I don't say that with judgment. I genuinely believe there are people who struggle to adapt to certain social norms or to aspects of themselves, and in response, they construct alternative frameworks through which they can make sense of their experiences. But the tragedy is that it's a constant pursuit of relief that never truly arrives because you're continually divorcing yourself from your own biological reality in order to achieve that relief. I can only imagine how deeply painful that must be to constantly distance yourself, not only from the conditions around you, but from what you believe yourself to be at the most fundamental level, continually reconstructing your identity in an attempt to find peace, continually divorcing yourself from your own biological reality so you can find some sort of meaning and purpose and justification for why you feel the way you do. Anyway, there's also another clip from this interview that's also going viral, but for a completely different reason.
I hope for anyone who's sort of, struggling in this time and the headlines and just to know like that you're, not alone and loved and celebrated by so many, and try and block out the noise from, absolute vile losers who must just be so profoundly uncomfortable with themselves they can't handle that someone could get to a place that I think, that, trans people do get to, which is a level of self-acceptance and understanding that I think is really beautiful and profound.
All of this is just so profoundly strange to me because it comes across as incredibly self-congratulatory and narcissistic. Like, nobody cares about you, dude. Sorry to tell you this, but really, nobody does. I don't think anybody is losing sleep over how Elliot Page feels about anything. The criticism isn't really directed at Page, to be honest. The overwhelming majority of the criticism surrounding the Odyssey is directed at how ridiculous Christopher Nolan's decision to cast Elliot as a Greek warrior seems to the majority of common sense people. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the majority of people don't really care about Elliot Page. Do whatever the hell you want with your life, dude. I think it's the constant performativeness and the constant need to shove your ideology down people's throats that causes people to respond to you. If Elliot were just living life, I don't think most people would even care. They wouldn't even be thinking about or even know who the hell Elliot Page is. But again, there's an aspect of narcissism here in Page's behavior. And I don't mean to pathologize Elliot too much, but I do think there's an aspect of narcissism that comes with seeking out this sort of identity. It's almost like everything has to center around you. You're constantly centering other people's reactions around this ever-shifting whack-a-mole type of personality that keeps changing. And it's almost like Elliot is constantly playing a role. You see this not just with Elliot, but with other people who are struggling with similar identity-related issues. It's never infinite. It's never defined. It's never an essence, right? It's always something that's finite until they find something else they can latch onto to justify why they feel the way they do. When your life is ruled by emotions, you're never going to have any level of consistency. And that's how you end up making comments like Elliot's, talking about how people are vile and this and that. Look, here's the thing. We need to differentiate between two very different things. If people are being legitimately hateful and spewing vitriol at someone, then sure, that's worthy of condemnation. But if people are simply criticizing your worldview, which I believe is highly flawed and illogical, that is not the same thing as hate. Criticizing bad ideas is one of the ways society checks itself. And I think that's something that should be constantly incentivized so that we don't normalize ideas that inevitably lead people into lives where they're constantly chasing their own tails, never finding fulfillment, and living with a perpetual sense of re-victimization because they keep creating these conditions for themselves, which in truth arise by trying to alter the one biological truth at the center of one's essence, which, to be honest with you, any and every person in the world will fail to do because they are made in God's image. You are that thing that you are. And because these people keep failing at changing who they are, their essence, they keep searching for new justifications and new ways to blame other people for these failures. Oh, you don't accept me. Oh, you don't accept me enough. Oh, actually, you're just hateful. Oh, you're a bigot. That's why the default becomes blaming the outside world, the external, instead of seeking correction within yourself. That's a pattern you see over and over again with people who embrace this sort of retarded worldview. Anyway, I'm not losing any sleep over what Elliot Page is doing with her life. I'm going to criticize the logic because I genuinely believe these ideas are bad and they're not founded in actual reality. But at the same time, I also pray for Elliot. I pray that Elliot finds peace. We're all made in God's image, and I see her pain. I see it in the way Elliot speaks. I see it in her permanent vocal fry. It's all there for anybody who wants to see it, witness it. And truly, I can only pray that somebody who's this profoundly hurt finds an outlet that isn't going to further lead to her self-victimization, because that's really what the cycle is, folks. It's watching someone re-victimize themselves in real time in an attempt to run away from whatever the boogeyman is that's chasing them. When, in fact, if they just accepted themselves for how God made them, perhaps they would find a little bit of peace.
It is so exceptional in sharing this information that we did not learn in school about gender and sexuality in the natural world, and follows Joan Roughgarden, brilliant evolutionary biologist who wrote Evolution's Rainbow, as well as other scientists researching and doing this incredible work and sharing this information. And the doc is not just deeply informative, it's also so funny and warm and inviting and expansive. And I really hope you get a chance to see it. And if you're not in New York or an area with screenings, you can also set up your own screening. So if you go to the Second Nature website, please reach out.
So in this clip, Elliot is talking about a nature documentary that teaches children animals can be gender fluid and LGBTQ, right? Unbelievable. Anyway, Elliot specifically says, as we heard here, and I want to quote this because I think it's an interesting claim to make. She says, it's so exceptional sharing this information that we did not learn in school about gender and sexuality in the natural world. Now, I mean, the goal here has never been clearer, right, folks? The goal is to reach children at the earliest age possible and influence them into buying into this horseshit ideology. How does this play out? Well, let me give you a brief summary of the documentary along with some basic data points so you can better understand what she's trying to communicate here. The documentary, Second Nature, Gender and Sexuality in the Animal World, is directed by Drew Denny and narrated and executive produced by Elliot Page. According to its description, the film explores the immense and naturally occurring diversity of gender expressions, same-sex relationships, and fluid identities within the animal kingdom, directly challenging human-centric myths about what is considered quote-unquote natural. The documentary highlights more than 1,500 species that display behaviors far outside what it describes as the rigid human gender binary. Now, I think it goes without saying, and as we discussed this a moment ago, the central argument in this documentary is deeply flawed. It's flawed for a multitude of reasons. Number one, biological reality is a thing. It's part of your essence. You are born the way you are born, and that's something you cannot simply avoid or redefine. To try to indoctrinate children into believing that they can change their biology because other animals behave in certain ways, or because some species are biologically and environmentally wired to behave differently due to evolutionary pressures or environmental advantages, is, in my opinion, deeply disturbing. It's the worst kind of propaganda when you think about it, because it's aimed at children at an age when they're especially susceptible, open, impressionable, and lack the knowledge and the discernment to understand what they're being exposed to. Which, let's be honest, it's exactly the reason why these buffoons are targeting children. This is about indoctrinating an entire generation into buying into this sort of horseshit ideology. I don't know any other way to describe it, to be honest. That said, I think this documentary and the broader narrative surrounding it should serve as a warning to every parent out there. They're going to misrepresent science. They're going to misuse it. They're going to cherry pick facts. They're going to use red herrings and examples from nature, examples, right, in quotes, from nature as a way to soften your child to these ideas and gradually bring them into this worldview. And in my humble opinion, this functions like a kind of sex cult. I think a lot of it stems from a deeply pornified culture. Obviously, there can be other contributing factors. There can be trauma, there can be molestation, there can be other life experiences that contribute to someone developing this sort of worldview. But I have a hard time believing that the hypersexualized, pornified culture we currently live in isn't contributing to this sort of horseshit culture, which is causing people in one way or another to fall further and further down these illogical rabbit holes that present themselves as a search for truth while ultimately revealing no truth at all, just another form of succumbing to the flesh. Because look, ultimately, there is truth, and that ultimate truth is God. All of us are made in God's image. You are who you are. You can't change that. That's simply the reality of our existence in our current situation. In fact, the harder you fight to become something you're not, the further you distance yourself from reality and the more pain you ultimately bring upon yourself. That's just a common experience of life. I could decide tomorrow that I want to be Asian. It's not going to work. I could move to China and tell everyone I see that I'm Asian. They're not going to believe me. I can try as hard as I want. It's never going to happen, okay? In fact, they will immediately clock me. And I don't even speak the language. I can insist on it all I want, but reality doesn't bend simply because I want it to. Anyway, folks, I could give you 1,000 examples like that. I think we all understand what the point is. We're not all water bottles just because we look in the mirror and say that we're water bottles hard enough. It's not how it works. Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below, and let's send out a prayer for these folks because I genuinely believe they're in pain. So much pain that they feel compelled to deny reality itself. It's not a good place to be, folks. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe, share it with a friend, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Peace.